a safe place, effective abuse prevention strategies for your organization. The issue of physical and sexual abuse is the #1 concern nowadays for organizations that have children's ministries, that are youth-serving organizations. And the sad truth about it is that in our country, as in the United States, people are no longer shocked when they hear about a new situation, a new allegation. To show you a little bit about how prevalent and how big of an issue this is, even while I was here today, I was given some communication about a new allegation against one of the churches that we insure, just in the time period that we've been here. Maybe I should stop putting these presentations on. I don't know if that's bad timing, but it is a prevalent issue. And even if you've not had an issue in your church or your community, it does affect churches in general. It's not just Roman Catholic churches. It's not just Anglican churches. I'll talk a little bit about that. And it doesn't affect just Christian charities. As I said earlier, this is a common issue that affects any organization that serves youth, children, and puts people in positions of trust over vulnerable persons. As other organizations in society are tightening up their screening procedures, are tightening up their procedures, their protocol, how they manage, if Christian organizations are not doing the same thing, what we're really doing is we're making ourselves the soft targets in our community for pedophiles. And I know we don't like to think about that, and I don't want to say for a moment that there's a pedophile lurking around every corner, but the problem is we live in a transient society. There are people with problems out there. They are looking for access to children. If there are green lights all the way from the time that they walk in the door, express an interest in children's ministry, and are put in the care in the trust position over children, you got a problem. In terms of conceptualizing abuse and abuse instances, what's the cost? What's the impact? And maybe the way to look at it is, this is a big, big issue, and visually you look at what the cost is. Now I'll flip back actually to the last. The victims, of course, the innocent victims, are the first things that come to mind. And it's an issue or a trauma that will be with them for the rest of their lives, even if they've gone through counseling and therapy. Think about how that breach of trust affects their ability to form relationships into adulthood. You know, becoming husbands or wives, having their own children, dealing with people who should be worthy of trust, and now they question. And how these things carry on generationally. And statistics are very deceiving sometimes, so you have to take this really carefully how you say it, but victims of abuse are themselves many more times likely to become abusers than others in society in general who are not abuse victims. It doesn't mean the majority are, it doesn't mean they all are, it just means that statistically it's significant. Statistically, they say 5 times as likely to become abusers themselves if they've been victims of abuse. It's emotional, psychological, spiritual trauma for a lifetime. It has effects on family and the community. I don't know if you've ever thought about it this way, but maybe you have, but think about it as a parent. You put your child into what you think is a safe place, a church, a school, a daycare, and your child becomes a victim of abuse. You know, it would be a powerless feeling and something you probably would have difficulty in forgiving yourself in a way, because you were the one that really thought, hey, this was a safe place. I put my child there. I can point the finger to them. But you think about the impact that that has on the parents' marital relationships, siblings, the larger echo in the family, and into future generations. It's significant. The reputations of the churches or charities, the ministries, what kind of impact that has on that church or that organization for years to come in the community. The numbers, the dollars, financial civil damages against the church, against the leaders, against individuals. And in the case of false allegations, destruction of reputations. And when I say this, what I mean by that is if you don't have good abuse prevention plan procedures in place, do you not put your workers in a vulnerable position to wrongful allegations, and then also put them in a position of having difficulty in defending themselves effectively? Okay. And again, as I said, visually you can see the impact of child sexual abuse and how many things it affects in the family, in the community. If your organization has not already implemented an effective prevention plan, or you're reviewing the adequacy of your existing protocol, we're hoping that the information in this presentation will help you. Of the organizations that are represented here, how many would be in the category of having qualified for full abuse coverage because you've got an approved prevention plan in place? Okay. And how many of you are still working on it to be able to qualify for coverage? Okay. Yeah. Sometimes we know what the rules are, we know what the guidelines are, but we don't understand the principles behind, well, why is Robertson Hall saying we have to have this? Why are lawyers saying we have to have this? And what I'm going to tell you is something in general. When you look at these policies and procedures, they fall into one of two categories generally. The first category is prevention. Think about screening. Think about weeding out the wrong people. It could be through criminal record checks. It could be through background references. And you find out information that suddenly you go, this person we cannot allow as a volunteer in our organization or to be anywhere near children. And that's preventative. That's the first item. The second is under the category, I would say, of due diligence. Because despite all our best efforts, and when we think about risk, at the end of the day, we still have risk. Are there unconvicted pedophiles around, unconvicted criminals? Yes. If we show due diligence, will we find out anything about them in advance? Maybe not. But our defense in a civil court isn't that the event didn't happen. It was that as leaders of the organization, we demonstrated due diligence and we checked into the things we could check into. We exhausted it. What was available to us, we acted on that information. That's our defense. And there is a concept in law, and it has to do with knowledge. And I'll explain this to you just very briefly. The first category of knowledge is actual knowledge. Pieces of information that you've got in hand. And if you're directors and officers of an organization and you know something and you don't act on it, and there's a bad consequence because of it, and it's proven in court, then it's a pretty strong basis for negligence. In other words, you couldn't just ignore it. It was a hot potato, it landed in your lap, you didn't act on it, something negative happened, now you're being held to account, you're up the creek without a paddle in a civil court. But there's another concept in law called implied knowledge. Those are not pieces of information you know. They're pieces of information you could easily have gotten had you only made an inquiry. Criminal record checks, background reference checks, all of these things. In civil courts, the two kinds of knowledge are equal. It doesn't matter whether it's an actual fact or something you could have checked. You're held to the same standard on either piece of knowledge. Think about that. So when we talk about these standards, we're talking either about preventative measures or we're talking about demonstrating due diligence. They're both important. And in the presentation, I'm going to do a little bit of an overview of why are churches and charities vulnerable. And hopefully this will hit you right between the eyes about why it is that when you walk through the doors of a church, it isn't automatically a safe place, just because it's your church. I'm going to talk a little bit about myths about abuse and abusers. I'm going to go through, we have a 7-point checklist. You've probably seen the checklist in a newsletter format. You've probably seen it on a declaration form. You kind of looked at the list and you've groaned, said, how are we ever going to do this? The list we put together as a way of pre-qualifying which organizations should have the coverage and which should not. And we didn't create these. We drew these from different sources in terms of what's effective, what helps you in court, and how it is that an insurance company would possibly, in their right minds, want to insure your organization for abuse. Think about that for a second. 180 companies and sources, mutuals across Canada that provide insurance. We've got a half a dozen that are willing to do it. Maybe there's a reason for it. Maybe the reason is they can't justify to their shareholders that they should take the risk. And a large part of what we do, and I'll try to put this in perspective for you, we want abuse coverage to be available for Christian charities in Canada. We want that. We're trying to make organizations insurable. If we don't do what we're doing, what's going to happen in the bigger picture is coverage is going to disappear from the insurance marketplace altogether. You'll have no coverage, period. And then watch what happens to risk management. Because the insurance company won't be there to pay the bill at all. And why should they? It's like pollution claims and mold claims. This is kind of on the brink. If you look at the Insurance Bureau of Canada, their new liability wording contains an absolute exclusion for abuse. It's the first time that liability policy is the standard policy that companies, they don't have to use the wording, but it's what they work off of before they make revisions and decide how broad or how narrow they want the coverage. The new IBC wording has an abuse exclusion. So this is not about the insurance company being the bad guys. In fact, the problem is that when you point to the insurance company and saying this is your fault, you're actually pointing to the wrong thing. This is the party that's agreeing to underwrite your costs if you get into trouble. They don't have to do this. They're agreeing to do this, and in our case, they're agreeing to do it on the basis that you've got these procedures in place, and that when you call our office and report, hey, there's been an allegation of abuse, there's going to be someone there to adjust the claim, to help defend the claim for you, and if there's a settlement or damages, to pay the freight for you, right? You're transferring risk. They don't have to do that, but they're saying, this is your part of the bargain. If you do this, then we'll be there for you. Think about that for a second, and think about it if you were the shareholder of the insurance company, would you want to be covering 6,000 charities across Canada for abuse? Think about that for a second. I'm going to talk a little bit about top 10 frequently asked questions about abuse prevention, and depending on time limitations, we may get more into this as well into our panel discussion. And just talking about resources that are available, unlike, say, 15 or 20 years ago, where there were very few resources in terms of sample prevention plans, multimedia assistance, training, consultants. Today, there are lots of good resources.